By early February 1943, roughly 91,000 Axis soldiers would march out of a ruined city and into Soviet captivity, the visible end of a catastrophe that had not begun as a catastrophe. What turned a protracted, grinding siege into one of Nazi Germany's most decisive defeats was not a single mistake, but an unexpected turn. A Soviet operational counterstroke that met a chain of German strategic missteps and a series of command decisions that together made the Sixth Army's fate all but sealed. July 1942. The German High Command stood at a crossroads. Operation Barbarossa, launched in 1941, had failed to produce a decisive collapse of the Soviet state. By the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht's strategic aim shifted east and south, toward vital oil fields in the Caucasus and the symbolic city that bore Stalin's name. Operation Blue, the plan for summer 1942, was designed to secure southern resources and deny them to the Soviet war effort. Then a pivotal change. Hitler ordered a simultaneous drive for the Caucasus and the capture of Stalingrad. Rather than concentrate forces on a single decisive objective, the German plan now split its efforts between economic gain and political symbolism. This was not a merely academic choice. In military terms, concentration of force, massing combat power at the point of decision, is a basic ingredient of operational success. Splitting objectives meant dividing attention, units, and supply lines. The decision to pursue both the oil and the city stretched German forces across vast distances, increased the length of supply lines, and created vulnerable flanks that would later prove fatal. If you want a deep dive into the turning points of the Eastern Front, subscribe. The strategic consequences of that July decision unfolded across months. German formations pushed toward the Volga and into Stalingrad's approaches, while elements swung south toward Grozny and the Caucasus. Command relationships tightened around Hitler's own directives. Dissenting professional officers found their options narrowing as Hitler increasingly imposed strategic priorities from above. The net effect: units operated with less flexibility, and operational commanders who foresaw risks found their ability to reposition or withdraw limited by political imperatives. On the ground, Stalingrad became the kind of battlefield that favored determined, well-prepared defense over mechanized maneuver. Urban terrain where tanks are blunted, supply lines are vulnerable to ambush, and small unit combat can sap an attacker's strength. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commanding the German Sixth Army, pursued a methodical campaign to capture the city block by block. Opposing him, General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army, adopted an approach that recognized the defender's advantage in rubble and ruins, trading space for time, anchoring defenses on industrial strongpoints, and fighting for iconic terrain that would become anchors for the struggle. The grain elevator, the tractor factory, Mamayev Kurgan. Those landmarks were not mere symbols. They were tactical and psychological anchors. The grain elevator rose like a tower among wreckage, a vantage point for snipers and artillery spotters. The tractor factory, with its labyrinth of workshops and conveyor pits, created kill zones where German assaults could be whittled down. Mamayev Kurgan, a hill overlooking the city, offered observation and artillery positioning. The German tactic, pushing into the city and attempting to seize these nodes, required close-quarters fighting that turned German advantages in mobility and armor into liabilities. Urban combat slowed the attackers, increased casualties, and consumed ammunition and fuel at rates that supply trains could not always match. While the Sixth Army was increasingly absorbed in house-to-house fighting, the situation beyond the ruined streets was deteriorating. The German positions on either side of Stalingrad were not held by equally capable units. Flanking responsibilities rested largely with allied Romanian armies, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, which had been given extended sectors with insufficient armor, artillery, and logistical depth. Those formations were thinly manned, lacked the heavy anti-tank reserves that the Wehrmacht's doctrine required to hold a wide front, and were susceptible to breakthrough by a determined mechanized strike. Soviet planners noticed these structural weaknesses. From the autumn of 1942, Soviet operational architecture had matured. Their ability to coordinate multiple fronts and launch complex simultaneous operations had improved significantly since 1941. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and his colleagues planned an audacious counter-offensive designed not to slug it out in the city, but to puncture the German lines where they were weakest, on the flanks held by Romania. That plan, Operation Uranus, was in operational terms a classic encirclement. Place mechanized and infantry forces on axes of advance that would break through the enemy's flank, swing around behind the main German effort in the city, and link up to trap the attacking units. Operation Uranus began on November 19, 1942. Its aim was precise: exploit the thinly held sectors, roll up the flanks, and meet in the rear of Stalingrad. Over the following days, Soviet armies advanced with momentum, collapsing Romanian positions, seizing bridges and crossroads, and moving behind German forward units. On November 23rd, Soviet pincers linked near Kalach on the Don, sealing a ring around the German forces in and around Stalingrad. What had been a protracted urban battle transformed almost overnight into a strategic emergency. Tens of thousands of men, the Sixth Army at its center, were surrounded. An encirclement, to be clear, is the operational act of surrounding and isolating an enemy formation so that it cannot resupply, reinforce, or retreat. For an army like Paulus's Sixth, being encircled meant the loss of freedom to maneuver and an immediate need to decide whether to fight outward, break the ring, or hold an attempt to be resupplied. Hitler's response to the encirclement set the next chapter of the crisis. Rather than authorize an immediate breakout, an operation that would have concentrated the Sixth Army's forces and attempted to punch through eastern sectors to link with friendly lines, Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to stand fast and hold Stalingrad. He accepted Hermann Göring's public assurance that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped troops by air. Göring, Reichsmarschall and head of the Luftwaffe, promised that German transport aircraft could bridge the resupply gap, allowing the Sixth Army to be sustained until a relief force could reach them. Those assurances would prove optimistic. Airlift to a besieged army requires three essential ingredients: sufficient transport capacity in aircraft and crews, secure and serviceable airfields close enough to the front so that sorties can land and unload heavier loads, and weather and air superiority conditions that permit regular operations. The Luftwaffe faced limitations on all three counts: the number of transport aircraft available, the ongoing demands across multiple fronts, the onset of winter weather, Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and fighters, and the condition of the few airstrips within the encirclement. Many of them improvised and covered in wreckage, combined to make a sustained, reliable air bridge unrealistic. Even optimistic German estimates of what the Luftwaffe could deliver fell short of the needs on the ground. Supply demands for food, ammunition, fuel, winter clothing, and medical supplies were enormous after weeks of urban combat. The daily tonnage required to keep an army fighting, to maintain minimum rations, to spare critical ammunition for defense, to evacuate the wounded, exceeded what the Luftwaffe could provide in practice. Aircraft losses to Soviet fighters and ground fire, the difficulty of unloading cargo quickly on rough airstrips, and regular weather interruptions further diminished effective throughput. Over the weeks that followed, promised deliveries became intermittent and inadequate. At the same time, German High Command attempted a relief operation under field conditions. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group Don, conceived and launched Operation Winter Storm, Unternehmen Wintergewitter, in December 1942. Its goal was straightforward in concept: break through Soviet lines west of the Ring and reach the Sixth Army, creating a corridor for a possible breakout or at least for resupply. Manstein's formations fought hard. For a brief period in late December, his armored spearheads drove within striking distance of the encirclement's western flank, perhaps 30 to 50 kilometers away, depending on the day's advances. Yet relief operations are measured not only by battlefield gains, but by the broader operational context. The Soviets did not merely sit passively while Manstein advanced. They launched additional operations designed to exploit German commitments to relief and to widen the strategic vice. Operation Little Saturn, launched in mid-December, struck at German and Allied forces farther to the south of the relief effort, threatening supply corridors and diverting attention and resources. The combined pressure blunted Manstein's thrust and complicated any plan for a coordinated breakout. The central decision point arrived in late December and January. Could the Sixth Army concentrate its remaining forces and attempt to break out to meet Manstein's spearhead? Commanders on the scene, including Manstein, argued for an authorized breakout that would have meant the Sixth Army abandoning much of its heavy equipment and attempting a high-risk maneuver to cross Soviet lines. Hitler refused. His hold order remained in effect. The Sixth Army was to stand fast and await relief and resupply. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. A promotion some interpreted as signaling that surrender would not be considered, since no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. But this symbolic act did not alter the material realities inside the pocket. Inside the Ring, conditions deteriorated steadily. Urban ruins that had once provided defensive advantages became a shrinking island of supply shortage. Food and fuel ran low. Winter cold intensified the suffering. Medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded men could not be evacuated. Ammunition became scarce for many units. Horses, a vital source of draft power for German logistics, were slaughtered for meat and to save the collapse of supply for some essential functions. Morale frayed as frostbite and starvation joined bullets and shrapnel as daily threats. Communications with higher command were disrupted and often filtered through an increasingly implausible promise of aerial salvation. The Luftwaffe did make sorties into the pocket. Crews flew under dangerous conditions and at great cost. But the aggregate delivered tonnage fell far below what the Sixth Army required to sustain offense or even robust defense. Weather, Soviet air operations, and the limitations of transport numbers meant that many scheduled flights were postponed or cancelled. Loaded aircraft could not always land at the makeshift airstrips inside the ring. Some had to parachute cargo or divert. Supplies that did arrive often consisted of small packages that could not substitute for the constant feed of fuel and heavy ammunition an army needs to operate. Manstein's relief force continued to probe for opportunities. He fought with skill and tenacity, achieving local tactical successes. Yet the German position across the front was complex. Commitments elsewhere, depleted reserves, and Soviet counterattacks reduced the window of opportunity. Crucially, the question of breakout authorization remained unresolved. For an army trapped and pressed from without, the best course often involves a combination of an external relief operation and an internal breakout timed to link with the relieving force. Without the nod to attempt that breakout, Paulus's hands were tied. His troops had to remain within the shrinking perimeter. January 1943 saw the pocket increasingly fragmented. Partial Soviet assaults and attritional pressure split German units and seized key positions. Starvation, exposure, and lack of medicine created a humanitarian disaster inside the ring. By early February, the operational fact was unavoidable. On February 2, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus, who had led his army through months of brutal urban combat and then into the encirclement, surrendered the remaining organized German resistance in Stalingrad. Approximately 91,000 Axis troops, including German and Allied soldiers, were taken into Soviet captivity. Of that number, only a small fraction, in the order of a few thousand, would eventually return to Germany. The human toll was severe. The Sixth Army's collapse led to deaths in combat, death from exposure and disease, and a long period of captivity for those taken prisoner. The material loss was also tremendous. An army's worth of weapons, vehicles, and stores were either captured or destroyed. The strategic consequence, however, extended beyond losses of men and material. The fall of the Sixth Army marked a decisive shift in momentum on the Eastern Front. For the Wehrmacht, it was a psychological and operational blow. The aura of invincibility that had lingered after early successes eroded. The initiative increasingly passed to the Red Army. Soviet forces gained confidence and experience in operational art that they would exploit in later campaigns. What made Stalingrad particularly illustrative was how the unexpected, the Soviet encirclement, interacted with a series of German choices. Operation Uranus was not a fluke. It was the product of growing Soviet operational competence and the ability to marshal coordinated blows. Hitler's decision to divide objectives, the resulting overstretch, the thinly held Allied flanks, and the insistence on holding ground at a symbolic city combined to place German forces in a situation where a well-executed Soviet plan could achieve encirclement. Once encircled, the German command's belief that the air could substitute for ground logistics and the refusal to sanction a breakout turned what might have been a grave but recoverable emergency into a decisive defeat. This sequence points to several broader lessons about command, logistics, and the conduct of war. First, strategy and symbolism can diverge. Political imperatives that prize symbolic victories risk undermining operational logic when they pull forces in multiple directions. Second, logistics are not an afterthought. Supply and transport constraints shape what is feasible on the battlefield. An army's endurance depends on the realistic assessment of how it will be sustained, not on promises that cannot be credibly fulfilled. Third, command rigidity carries risk. When decision-making is centralized to the point that field commanders are prevented from acting on immediate tactical realities, opportunities for recovery can be lost. Stalingrad also exemplified the maturation of Soviet operational art. The Red Army of 1942 was not the same force as that of 1941. Between those years, Soviet commanders had reorganized, re-equipped, and learned to coordinate massed armor, artillery, and infantry in depth operations. Operation Uranus demonstrated the ability to orchestrate large formations and to exploit enemy weaknesses at the operational level, not merely the tactical. The result was a strategic reversal. The Soviet Union seized the initiative and would maintain it through subsequent years of the Eastern Campaign. It is important to avoid facile moralizing or to paint the outcome as the product of fate rather than of choices. The events at Stalingrad illustrate how operational opportunities and failures combine. The Soviet counterstroke was skillfully planned and executed. German defeat there was not inevitable, but it was increasingly likely once strategic priorities and command decisions produced an exposed formation in a hostile environment. The unexpected turn, therefore, was both an operational success and a mirror showing pre-existing German vulnerabilities. The images that return from Stalingrad are stark: a city of smashed buildings under grey winter skies, artillery blasts throwing up clouds of brick dust, small groups of men fighting for a single factory hall or a battered earthwork. But beneath those images is the arithmetic of war: distances, supply tonnage, the readiness of units on a flank, the availability of transport aircraft, the timing of offensives, and the human choices that set that arithmetic in motion. In the end, the unexpected turn at Stalingrad was decisive because it exposed a chain of avoidable weaknesses that together transformed a hard-fought siege into a catastrophic encirclement and surrender. It was an intersection of Soviet operational competence and German strategic miscalculation, compounded by command choices and logistical shortfalls. The surrender of the Sixth Army shifted initiative decisively to the Red Army and marked a turning point from which the Wehrmacht struggled to recover. What remains clear in military terms is that the conduct of campaigns often depends less on single moments of heroism than on coherent decision-making, realistic logistics, and the capacity to adapt. Stalingrad shows how a single operational blow, encirclement, can become a strategic pivot when one side is prepared to exploit weaknesses and the other is compelled by symbolic imperatives and flawed assumptions to hold at all costs. Consider as a final point the broader pattern that followed. After Stalingrad, German forces more frequently found themselves on the defensive, reacting to Soviet initiative rather than imposing theirs. Hitler's pattern of direct intervention in operational matters, the reliance on symbolic objectives, and the misreading of logistical realities would recur in subsequent campaigns, reinforcing the strategic damage inflicted in late 1942 and early 1943. If this episode raises questions for you about command responsibility, logistics, or the nature of operational art, share your thoughts in the comments. What, in your view, was the single most decisive decision at Stalingrad? And if you want more detailed explorations of specific turning points on the Eastern Front, from Kursk to the Vistula offensives, check the playlist linked at the end to continue the series.